So I'm joined by Jessica Manzi. She's with the City of Redwood City's Community Development Department, and she is the transportation manager, and she is the project manager for this entire effort. And I'm also joined by Melissa Rijardo. She is with Caltrain, and she is a chief planner over there, and she is available to answer questions on the Caltrain service and other topics that are related to the Caltrain rail system. We have engineers here from AECOM. They are working on behalf of the project for the city. And Millette Litzinger and Peter DiStefano are here. They are able to answer questions related to the alternatives and to some of the engineering details that we know so far. This project, again, is in the very beginning. And so we may not be able to answer all your engineering questions, but I think we can give you a good understanding of what we know today and when we'll have more certainty. We also have Bill Hurl here. He is a traffic engineer as part of the team, and he's available to answer traffic questions. And I'm sure he'll be quite the star on February 3rd as well to answer those questions that come up between now and then as we are posting more information. So with that, really appreciate your attendance. We hope you are able to stay for the entire meeting. And of course, if you are not able to, we understand. There's no quiz at the end, but we do appreciate your attendance. I'm just going to kick right in. I do not yet see any questions posted from our audience, so I'm just going to start right away with a question that has come up through the website as well as at the other meeting and it's on top of mind for many, many projects these days, is why is this project needed and why are we keeping going with something as big as ambitious as this during COVID? So I'm going to ask Jessica with the city to help us understand why the city's moving forward with this project at this time.
Great, thanks, Eileen. So first of all, just generally why we're exploring a grade separation project is because it's going to reduce the barrier that's created in road tracks and create opportunities for increased train service. Grade separations increase connectivity and safety and can reduce congestion and train horn noise. With ongoing development that we've seen near the tracks, it's really important for us to identify the space needs for any future grade separations so that we can minimize the total overall cost. Caltrain's board adopted service vision for 2040 assumes a significant increase in the number of trains on the corridor, which will require a 4-track hub station at the middle of the corridor, and downtown Redwood City has been identified as the location for this hub station. The increase in trains will create additional delays for crossing the tracks if they're left at grade, and separations are needed where we will have 4 sets of tracks. Now, as to the question about why we're doing it now in the middle of a pandemic, is primarily because these projects are huge infrastructure projects that take a very long time to deliver. And so if we want to be able to deliver a project probably 7 to 10 years from now is when we need to start the planning work. And everything that we've seen nationally and internationally within the profession is people are expecting the need to move around our communities to return to normal once the pandemic is out of the way. You know, our travel patterns may be different, but that's not going to negate the need for people to move around the cities for whatever needs, whether it's work or going anywhere else. If everybody starts driving, nobody's going to be going anywhere. So we really want to make sure that we're investing in our transit infrastructure for the future.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think following on that, because I do know, and for those people who have had a chance to go out into the virtual site or on the regular website, know that there are several alternatives in consideration right now and beginning here in the planning process. And so one question that keeps coming up is who's going to make the decision and decide ultimately which alternative might move forward or alternatives, and how can the public play a part to that? And sort of how does that part of this work so that people understand that as we talk more about these alternatives. And for those of you who may not have had a chance to really dive deep into our virtual site, in a little bit, we do have a question that we have harvested from the website that allows Millette in particular to give you a Reader's Digest version of each of the alternatives that are in play. So this is a question for Jessica more about process, and then we'll get into a question and something that'll relate specifically to the various alternatives so that if you don't already know what they are, we'll be getting to those specifics in just a minute. So the process, Jessica, who's making the decision and how's that going to happen?
Sure, thanks, Eileen. That's a great question, one we hear a lot. So right now we have a technical advisory team, and the Redwood City community are both helping the project team develop and refine alternatives that will get us to the point of having a preferred alternative. One of the ways the community can provide their feedback is by participating in these sessions and by completing the survey. While the preferred alternative needs to meet Caltrain's design standards, it's ultimately up to the city and the city council to select the preferred alternative. So this really is a project that's largely in the control of the city itself.
Great. And, you know, as you talked about, these are long-term projects. So is there some sort of schedule that's related to how all of this will come together?
Sure, and actually this would be, yeah, and that would be an opportunity. Millette, if you want to pull up the schedule slide just to illustrate this a little bit more. Give a little variety. Well, while we're waiting for Millette to pull that up, I can just get started. So basically, these are really big, complex projects that take a lot of time. So they typically take 7 to 10 years to plan, design, and build. A project for a single crossing would be towards the shorter edge of that range, while a citywide project where we're separating all 6 of our at-grade crossings would be toward the longer end. This, of course, assumes that we have funding at each stage of the project. We're currently at the very beginning of this process where we're determining if a project is feasible, and if so, which grade crossings we want to separate and when. Thanks for getting that, Millette.
Yeah, sorry for the delay there.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Sorry, I'm just getting to my list of questions. Okay, okay, perfect. This leads right into the next question, which is Millette's. And since you do have your screen share, this is perfect. What are the railroad alternatives being considered, and what is the height of the track for each? This has been a big question for the community. What are they going to be looking at, and how high might something be?
Yeah, so hopefully you guys are seeing my screen. We do have 4 alternatives that we are considering, and I'm going to walk through the rail profile for each of them. So what you need to do here is imagining like you're standing in El Camino Real looking toward US 101, and you're kind of seeing a slice through the railroad tracks here. And on these exhibits, the green dash line is the existing rail profile, and the red line is the proposed rail profile. And the one you're seeing here is alternative 1. And as you can see from the red line, we would be elevating the tracks throughout the city. And this is a very high cost alternative, but it would fully grade separate the most at-grade crossings at once. The second alternative and the third alternative would be a little bit less ambitious than alternative 1. It still elevates the tracks throughout the city, but it does it in 2 phases, with Whipple Brewster Broadway being in the first phase. And that's shown by the solid red line in this exhibit. And then Maple, Main, and Chestnut would be elevated in a second phase, and that's shown by the red dashed line in this graphic. In alternative 2, the Jefferson Avenue rail structure would be raised in phase 1, along with the improvements that would be done with Whipple, Brewster, and Broadway. The third alternative is very similar to alternative 2, except that Jefferson being raised is pushed to phase 2. So phase 1 is represented by the solid red line, and then phase 1 is a solid red line, and phase 2 is the dashed red line. So very similar to alternative 2. And then lastly, alternative 4 would be an elevated track at Whipple only. This is the least complex of the alternatives that we're looking at, and it has no impacts to Jefferson Avenue.
And then how high? Yeah.
Yeah, so then this last slide here shows what the height of the railroad is at each of the cross streets for the 4 alternatives. It's summarized in this table. And you can see the rail height is the difference between the new proposed track and the cross street that's below. And in alternative one, for example, the tracks are elevated throughout the whole city. So you can see the heights range from 23 feet at Whipple to 6 feet at Chestnut. And then conversely, alternative 4, which is Whipple only being grade separated. So you only see that as having a 9-foot increase, and then all the other cross streets have no change in height, so there's 0.
Great.
I just had one more slide. Sorry, Eileen. Just wanted to highlight that a lot of the 4 alternatives that we're looking at do introduce the idea of closing some of the streets. And if you, we're going to look in the virtual room pretty soon, but if you wanted to find out more specifics about these 4 alternatives related to each of the cross streets, you can go in the website and click the location, the blue location marker at the cross street that you want. And I'm using the red arrow to point to that in this slide.
I just wanted to add one thing. The profiles that Millette are showing, and also seen in the VR room, those are exaggerated 50 times. So they look like roller coasters, but those grades are generally very flat. 1% is the maximum we're using. So when you're riding on that on a train, you could really barely notice, you know, a steady climb. It's a long, steady climb. That's how we get the elevation differences that she shows on that table.
Thanks, Peter. Spoken as a true engineer. I love that. So thank you for that. And while we have this slide up, I think it's a good time to ask Millette another question that's come in. As I mentioned, you know, we're going to be posting additional traffic information, but I do know that there is already some information. There's been a question that's come in that said, where can I find more information on the traffic impacts? So Millette, can you share with us how that might be done or where that is in the virtual room since we have that open?
Yeah, and this is a screenshot, so I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to ask Peter to start sharing the virtual room link there too, so we can live click on some of the exhibits there.
Great.
But, and as he does that, I can start to explain. We do have information on what the traffic impacts would be as it relates to the existing traffic volumes. And when you go in the virtual room, Peter's going to pan over here to the right, and then you can see an easel board over here where the grade separation information, not only our videos, but some of our documents are starting to be populated. And he can click on the existing traffic link there. And even though we are working on the traffic analysis for the 2045 volumes, and so we'll update that in this room prior to our next Q&A session, and which will highlight the results of the traffic analysis related to in the future year of 2045, whereas this one just is related to the existing traffic volume counts. And I'm probably going to have you leave it there, Peter, because I think that probably will also be our next topic.
Good. Yes, I'm starting to get some feedback from our Q&A function. I just want to do a little bit of a reminder and an update for those who have joined us. That website that we're demoing can be reached if you want to follow along with us at rwctransitplan.com. And the RWC, of course, is Redwood City, but it's just the initials, RWC Transit Plan, all one word, .com. So if you want to follow along on that, that would be great. So yes, our next question does continue down this traffic, the traffic line, and I think probably it's a little bit more detailed for Bill. And let me read that. My question is sort of jumping around here. Sort of what are the big impacts, if any, that you've seen, just generally speaking, Bill, that you could start to speak to with regard for what you're learning so far about the different grade separations at the different alternatives? So when they're all grade separated, when some of them are, et cetera. Can you share with us what you're what you're starting to find?
Yes, Eileen, thanks. So actually these diagrams are a summary of what we have determined will be the implications of the various alternatives, and I'll take you through this. They look at what we call level of service for traffic, which is traffic conditions graded on a scale from A to F, with A being very good and F being very poor. So we looked at the existing conditions. We looked at what is called a situation where all the crossings are grade separated, which is the most aggressive ideal situation in terms of traffic. And then we looked at a couple different combinations that I'll talk about. So with the all at grade situation, which is what you have today, essentially there's significant congestion that occurs in the morning peak period. The Whipple and El Camino Real intersections are congested, and in the afternoon, the entire most of the intersections in the area, as shown on the diagram, are congested. If you go to a situation where you grade separate all three locations, meaning Whipple, Brewster, and Broadway, you end up with much improvement, as you can see, with service levels mostly between B and C, which are quite good in an urban area. And then looking at the alternatives, if you look at the first one, the Whipple and Brewster grade separated, but Broadway closed. What happens there is we find there is that particular alternative is not much different from the all grade separated, meaning that there is enough capacity to absorb the traffic from the Broadway closure. Because as you can imagine, when you close a crossing, the traffic that was using it gets diverted to these other routes. So there's some increase in traffic using both Brewster and Whipple, but with the grade separations at those locations, there's enough capacity to absorb that. So it works, that works fairly well. If you only grade separate Whipple and close both Broadway and Brewster, the situation is a little different. In that case, a lot of traffic is diverted over to Whipple, and the Whipple crossing and the intersections nearby, as you can see from the diagram, they go to a very poor levels of service, F. So that particular option has quite a bit of impact on traffic. And it's probably it is the most extreme of all the different alternatives that we looked at. And then if we want to shift to the south section, great, thanks, Millette. It's kind of the same scenario. Here we're looking at the intersection or the crossings, Main and Maple and Chestnut. And we have all at grade existing and all at grade separated. I mean, kind of the two extreme cases. Now, existing in this area, generally traffic conditions are quite good. In the area, there are some issues with queuing of traffic and so forth near the crossings that occur. But there isn't any real major significant congestion. Of course, then when you go to all grades separated, you increase capacity even further, but it doesn't have a dramatic effect because of what I just said. You're already at a fairly good situation. When you look at the first option where the Main and Maple grade separations, crossings are grade separated, but we close Chestnut, you can see that also performs quite well. There's capacity to absorb the traffic diverted from Chestnut, and the traffic service levels don't change in any dramatic fashion. If you grade separate just Main and close both Maple and Chestnut, that causes a little more impact, but still the conditions are relatively good in this area. So there's a big difference, as you can see, from what happens in the northern area and the southern area in terms of the implications of these grade separations. to sort of wrap up the answer, there's some things that need to be thought about, and that's particularly in the South area, you might say, well, look, why change anything? It doesn't seem to be that big of a problem, but traffic volumes will increase. It may take a while to where they get back to pre-COVID levels, but they will, and then there will be growth. Our analysis takes into account development that's planned and proposed in the immediate area, and we know there's going to be growth in traffic from that. Also, we know that the number of trains using these crossings is going to increase over time. Caltrain's business plan calls for roughly a doubling of the amount of train traffic. And right now, for example, out of the peak hour, about 12 minutes of the hour is time when the gates are down at these intersections. So that, and if you think about doubling that time, that's a pretty dramatic change. So it's important to think about that, not just what's today, but what would be in the future. And doing nothing does result in much worse conditions. We know that much from what we've done already on the future analysis. And with that, I'll turn it back to Eileen.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So let me take a couple from the chat box. The first one here is do any of the plans include any pedestrian only crossings under the raised rails? And I think it's important to note that, we did focus on traffic with cars, but also certainly when gates are down, if there's no other way to get by, that would impede bikes and pedestrians as well. So important question coming in from our audience. So Peter, I'm going to ask you, do any of the plans include pedestrian only crossings under the raised rails? Peter?
Yeah, we have, there's some options, and you can check it out in the VR room at Chestnut and at Maple and at Broadway. So take a look at the exhibits there and you'll see, actually at Brewster too, that we're developing as we speak. But yes, there are some cases where we're showing what if scenarios of pedestrian bike crossings only.
Great. Okay.
So Peter, can you show us one of those on the website?
Yeah, that would be great.
Sure. Let's take a look.
There we go.
Let's take a look at the one at Chestnut.
rwctransitplan.com.
So here is the one at Chestnut. This is showing a closure. The X is showing a closure for motor vehicles, but the red areas are the pedestrian ramps that descend down into an undercrossing, and the yellow areas are stairways that kind of climb back up to street level. So that's one example.
Okay, a follow-on question that's also come from our audience tonight is, are there any plans for additional tunnels for pedestrian or bicycles only? And for example, this person is suggesting Howard Street. So Jessica or Peter, somebody want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that. So far our focus has really been on studying what happens at each of the existing 6 at-grade crossings. But we can explore the possibility of reconnecting streets that were previously closed at the tracks. And these sort of reconnections are most likely to happen just for bikes and pedestrians rather than for all modes. So if there are locations that you think should be prioritized for that, please let us know. You can email us at transitplan@redwoodcity.org, put it in the chat box. So far, we have heard interest in reconnecting Hopkins Avenue. And that's, in the scheme of things, probably one of the more feasible locations, just because most of the alternatives have the tracks elevated quite a bit at Hopkins. So reconnecting it would be less of an effort than it might be in some other locations.
Great, thank you. One of our other questions is, how are the alternatives being evaluated? You have a lot of combinations and permutations. So what process does the team use to sort through all of these different pros and cons and impacts and opportunities? Millette? Millette, are you on mute perhaps? I don't hear you.
Yeah, and can you repeat the question, Eileen?
Yeah, the question is about how are all these alternatives being evaluated? So there's a lot of combinations that involve, sort of opportunities in some cases or impacts in others. And how do you as a team sort through all of this information? The question is, how are they being evaluated?
Yeah, thank you. So we've had many stakeholders involved in developing what our evaluation criteria that we're going to use to evaluate the 4 alternatives that I outlined. And it looks like Peter's already jumped ahead and is showing you that evaluation matrix and where it is on the site. And what we are doing here is in the first column here, you can see it lists the criteria of that we have developed, and there are several categories that begins with traffic circulation, and it has environmental and socioeconomics, etc. as you go down the chart. And then I wanted to note that based on responses that we got from our previous community survey, the first 3 criteria, which we've denoted with an asterisk, those were in the survey responses we received, those were identified as the most important criteria to the community. So we put those at the top of the table. And then what I wanted to highlight was that we used this graphic. We're using a bar graphic to indicate what of the alternatives has the most improvements versus the most impacts. So if you look here, and I'm going to try to move this screen so I can actually see the chart. It's a little small on my screen right now. And I was going to walk through maybe the first one here that is related to traffic. So thank you, Peter, for zooming in there. So just to give you an example of the 4 alternatives that we looked at, you heard from Bill that, adding grade separations does improve the conditions significantly throughout the city. So we ranked this alternative as, 2 blue squares, which mean, that was the most improvement. But as you scroll to the right and look at the other alternatives, we did also rank 2 and 3 very similarly because they're, adding the grade separations in the north end of the city really do improve the traffic situation. And then the last alternative, number 4, where we were looking at grade separating Whipple only. This does have, traffic impacts, and that's because if we were only grade Whipple only, then we would also need to close Brewster and Broadway. And that's recommended because of the 4 track that would be at the station, and that would result in a lot of traffic on Whipple with those 2 closures in the north end of the town. So right now, we've put just this example that I've walked through is related to the existing traffic volumes. When we complete our analysis of the 2045, we'll also add those to the mix of this evaluation matrix.
Thanks, Millette. We have a question here about why can't there be a grade crossing at a 4-track segment or station? And that sounds like a bit of a Caltrain issue. So Melissa, could you take that one?
Yeah, no problem, Eileen. So while there's no regulation which specifically prohibits 4 mainline tracks at an at-grade crossing, certainly modifying the crossings to add 2 mainline tracks would have to be authorized through a formal application process to the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, who would very likely protest 4 mainline track at-grade crossings for obvious safety reasons. So it's really not seen as best practice.
Because it takes too long to cross over all of that real estate if you're on a bike or a ped or a car?
Yeah, especially in a busy downtown area, yes.
Yep, great. Well, while I've got you, and maybe this is a question for you, or maybe it's a question for Jessica. There's a question that's come through our questions tonight, and it says, there's been some talk about a possible station at Redwood Junction. Is that the only possible future Dumbarton rail project, or might Caltrain be routed through Redwood Junction? So if someone could take that question, that would be great. So the Redwood Junction.
Jessica, do you want to start and I'll add in, or do you want me to start?
I think that's a you start and I'll add in if there's anything else.
Okay, and Eileen, can you just state the question for me one more time so I'm sure to answer all aspects of it?
Yes, absolutely. So the question is, there has been some talk about a possible station at Redwood Junction. Is that only for a possible future Dumbarton rail project, or might Caltrain be routed through Redwood Junction?
Okay, so Caltrain, this issue has come up for Caltrain. And so what it looks like is that Redwood Junction would likely be looked at as an infill station separate from this grade crossing analysis. You know, there's a variety of places up and down the Caltrain corridor that have come up for this reason. This is one location that we will be looking at. And yes, so I guess to answer the question directly, it could also be a Caltrain station in addition to a Dumbarton station, but TBD, work needs to be done. And we also acknowledge at Caltrain that even if an infill station were not to be built, there is a lot of room to improve connectivity in the North Fair Oaks area. And so that's something we're especially interested in looking at, especially in regard to our new equity policy. We want to make sure we're giving good service to areas like North Fair Oaks, which has been historically disadvantaged. And with that, I'll throw it over to Jessica to add anything that I may have missed.
I don't know. I think you nailed it. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm going to switch to a different topic. We are getting some more through the chat related to costs, but I've got some other topics that are in front of that one. So what are the typical impacts during construction when you're constructing a grade separation project? And Peter, I know that you've got experience with that, so I'm going to throw this one to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. Yeah, there's a variety of impacts that are often introduced during construction and basically out of need for the contractor to get the project built. So for example, there could be a temporary loss of street parking, closure of driveways, maybe with modified access to those properties. Lane width reductions are needed on occasion, lane or sidewalk closures in some cases. And then in extreme cases, there could be a complete street closure. And in those cases, the contractor will make an effort to not close, like, let's say, 2 adjacent streets simultaneously. For example, Maple and Main are very close together. So if there's, let's say, bridge work being done one night on Main, they'll keep open Maple open, and vice versa. And typically this work is done during off-peak hours. These closures, I should say, are done during the off-peak hours at night and on the weekends. And similarly, there could be impacts also to the Caltrain ridership also during construction. On occasion, there's a need to place the trains, the northbound and southbound trains, on single track. And again, those are typically done over about a 48 to 54-hour window on the weekends, again, during the off-peak hours.
Great, thanks, Peter. So now here's another question I think is for you. It's come in, it says, what will the elevated tracks be on when not crossing the road? So will be it on some sort of solid structure with concrete walls? Is it a hill with grassy or rock embankments? Is it a bridge with, you know, kind of like some of the elevated freeways or BART? So do we know what it's going to be on? And are there extra things that we should be aware of that are choices to that? So Peter, if you could speak to whether this is a grassy hill or more permeable, or how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, yeah, I got some pictures I got up on the screen here. So in most cases, the rail corridor, because it's developed on each side of the corridor, we'll have a retaining wall on each side to kind of narrow up the width, because there's really not room to put in a nice gently sloped embankment with landscaping. But there are occasions, like say, for example, this is a cross section of another project where we could landscape in front of the wall and have the road that runs parallel, for example, El Camino. This could be an opportunity actually be north of Whipple. And I think I got a picture of a similar, this is, I think this is at F Street in San Carlos, where you can see here the embankment slope that comes into a retaining wall adjacent to the frontage road. The reason the walls are typically done versus, let's say, a viaduct structure or just a regular structure, it just really comes down to cost. It's a lot more economical to put it on on retaining wall versus an open structure. So we got to strategically, determine where we're going to place those structures. And of course, those will be at the streets. And then on occasion, we'll have them potentially for, we were mentioning before, like Hopkins, for example. That could be also a location where there's a structure or an undercrossing structure for peds and bikes.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned that word cost. I know we've got a question in the hopper, but there's a few in front of that. So I just want to let that person know that we'll get to the cost question, but we've got this question in front. And we did start to talk about this with some of the earlier questions, but here's a question. How can the project improve connections for people walking and biking in Redwood City? I think this is a little bit broader than the original question, which was somewhat specific to a location. Jessica, was there anything you wanted to add to this?
Sorry, I always remember the unmute. So I think my answer is pretty similar. Again, wherever we're proposing any full closures or where we need to have a full closure for safety purposes, we're going to do everything we can to make sure we maintain connectivity for people that are walking and biking. But as I mentioned before, if there are locations where there's not an existing connection that you think would really benefit from one, let us know, because I think there are locations where there could be potential for reconnecting streets that are currently severed by the railroad tracks as a way to increase connectivity for people that are walking and biking.
Well, it isn't a huge benefit that once that the train service goes more doubled, as Bill said, that also just having access is an improvement over what would be with a bunch of gate downtime and no connection.
Yep.
Yep. So that's good news. So thank you. But while I've got you on the floor, there's a question here about in the previous newsletter mailer that went out last fall, there were survey questions that were asked about the transit district planning, a lot of pictures and things that people were asked to weigh in on. And so this person's wondering how this effort is being coordinated with that other effort. So how's the grade separation study coordinating with something that looked more like a downtown planning effort?
Great. Thanks for that question. Yeah, and Peter's already over into the VR room showing you where you can find some more information about the sort of umbrella transit district planning effort and how what we're doing relates to that. But to give you, again, the sort of Reader's Digest version, the transit district plan is going to define what type and how much development is going to be station area. It's a little bit larger than that. But also looking at where future streets might be and define what space is needed for a new train station and bus depot. So as we identify a preferred alternative from the grade separation study, that's going to tell us where the new station is going to be located and how people will get to the station platforms and where people will be able to cross the train tracks. And so this includes everybody, whether you're walking, driving, riding bikes, or anything else. So this information is going to be incorporated into the transit district plan. And as you said, we've got this series of boards for the transit district plan at the different components in detail. If you click on the transportation improvements boards, maybe get back out of there to the blue station. There's a lot of cool things to look at here. One of my favorites is the multi-track stations. You can learn more about Caltrain's plans and Dumbarton plans, but we also have this board that shows examples of what different multi-track stations can look like. I think this is a really fun place to spend some time thinking about how we really would re-envision our transit station in downtown and make it a really engaging, vibrant place to be in a way to really welcome people to Redwood City. So take a look at that. You'll get a better idea of how this fits in, but very much coordinating with this broader planning effort as we progress the grade separation study.
Thank you. So Melissa, I've got a couple that are on deck for you, and one is related to the fact that Caltrain's been involved with a lot of grade separation projects, and they're wondering if you've learned any lessons. Are there lessons learned and mistakes maybe made that could be corrected by the time you're potentially building something in Redwood City, or is there anything that you can speak to that would relate to lessons learned?
Sure. I think there have been many lessons learned from grade separation projects, especially those constructed in recent years. I think some notable considerations include addressing utilities very early in the project development process, as they can often cause construction delays. Comprehensively considering multimodal access and bicycle and pedestrian connectivity, specifically in grade separation design, especially because, as we consider, these grade separation designs that propose to close streets and remove crosswalks, this gets to become pretty critical to make sure we maintain at minimum and hopefully enhance connectivity, especially in downtown areas like Redwood City. And these considerations are, of course, important not only for the construction phase, but of course, the final condition. I think we've also learned about the importance of thinking about the impact to urban environment in terms of the need for retaining walls. We understand that retaining walls, while necessary, they often inhibit access and connectivity. And so how do we develop designs where this isn't a huge issue, or where we can avoid some of those barriers that we're often trying to eliminate in grade separation projects. I think we've also learned that we need to consider design that reduces the potential for vandalism, graffiti, and homeless encampments. And I think another really important lesson learned, and I think we've done a better job, especially with our electrification project, is ensuring robust communication during construction. Just making sure that the community is well aware of our progress, and any anticipated changes to the construction sites are just important, so that people can modify their travel behavior, for instance, accordingly. So that's just sort of a smattering of lessons learned, but there have been many.
Okay, thank you. That's very, very good answer. A lot of lessons learned, I think. So here's one that's just come in. It talks about Redwood City Moves, RWC Moves, recommends that a cycle track on Brewster and James. Are these coming with this project as safe routes to transit? So I think that's a Jessica question.
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So it's a little bit complicated, I would say. Certainly, if you look at thanks for pulling up the VR room there, Peter. So if you look at the aerial map, you've got that pink shaded area. So those are that's the limits of the transit district plan. And that's where we're going to have some sort of more detailed ideas about where the streets are going to be and what the streets look like. James is clearly within the limits of that transit district planning area. And so we would expect to be considering cycle tracks within that area. I don't expect that it's gonna, as part of that plan, we may be identifying those connections to get to the transit district, but wouldn't necessarily be building those cycle tracks with the redevelopment of the project there. On the flip side, if you look at Brewster, it's really sort of on the outer limits of the transit district planning area. And what's a little bit different is, actually, maybe go ahead, and Peter, and click on the Brewster alternatives. And I can show you, it doesn't want to be clicked. And just go for maybe the first one. So, and section A, thank you. In this case, some of the alternatives are going to, actually many of the alternatives are actually going to result in a need to change how the street is actually configured in response to construction. So that is an opportunity for us to put in new bike infrastructure. That's actually shown here in this cross section. I do want to put a little bit of just a disclaimer that we're so early in the process, we don't know exactly what the street cross section may look like. But since it is shown in this section, I wanted to bring it up and just as an illustration of what it could be. But as sort of a big response, whenever we do these grade separations, we are looking at making sure we have better bike and pedestrian infrastructure where it makes sense. And because Brewster was identified to get cycle tracks, that is really what we're going to try and provide as part of the grade separation project. So this is one of those areas where the response depends a little bit about whether you're talking about the transit district and any redevelopment that might happen as part of the sort of redevelopment of the land that's there versus what might happen with the grade separation project.
Okay, thanks. So I've got two questions here. One that's just come in from someone who's just joined us. And I think that we talked about a little bit of what this person just is asking about, but also it's related to a question that had come in through the website where it was a bit of a broader question about for tracking. So let me read all of the questions, and then I think really there's probably a combination of both Jessica and Melissa to answer this. So just for our new attendees, Jessica is with the city of Redwood City. She is the transportation manager in the city's community development department. And Melissa Rijardo is with Caltrain. She is a key planner for them. So here's the question that's come in through the tonight. And then I've got a little bit of an add-on, so maybe we can answer it all at the same time. So this person just tuned in, isn't sure if this question has already been asked, but are there alternatives that include a 4-track grade separation south of the current station, which could better accommodate the future projects such as Dumbarton Transbay connections and increased Caltrain high-speed rail service by considering passing tracks? The concern is that the 2-track grade separations could or would inhibit that. And then we had a question that seems a little bit similar that is similar that had come in through our previous work, and that is, why do the alternatives not include for tracking throughout the whole downtown? Seems like that's an important thing for the system's operational performance and resilience. Thank you, team. Good work. Don't be afraid to be bold. You have support. So I'm not quite sure they're the same question, but they certainly have a similar theme. So Melissa and Jessica, how do you want to take those questions?
Yeah, so let me start, and then Jessica, you can fill in any gaps that I leave behind. But I think this is a slightly longer. There's a long answer to this, so bear with me. But I'm going to try to break it up for you. So the Caltrain service vision is based off what we call the moderate growth scenario, if you followed along to that process. And it includes 8 Caltrain trains and 4 high-speed rail trains per direction per hour in 2040. So to support this level of Caltrain and high-speed rail service, we've identified a 4-track station as being required on the Mid-Peninsula to support primarily transfers between Caltrain Express and local trains. Because of its supportive land uses and densities, downtown Redwood City, we think, is the absolute best selection for this station, for the 4-track station, which would bring more service to the city and it would increase ridership. So building off this, the grade separation study takes the 4-track station requirement into account. The High-Speed Rail Authority has made no indication that they would like to stop at Redwood City, and therefore no such plans are included in the grade separation work, and a Redwood City station is not reflected in any agreements that Caltrain has with high-speed rail. So that's sort of the first part. I also think it's worth noting that if you followed along to the business plan process, you'd also know that there was a high growth scenario that was not adopted. However, when our board adopted the moderate growth scenario as our identified service vision for 2040, they asked staff to not preclude the high growth scenario. So this is my long answer here. What does it mean to not preclude? It really means don't make it a lot more difficult or a lot more expensive to implement the high growth scenario at some point in the far future. So the high growth scenario includes 12 Caltrain trains and 4 high-speed rail trains per direction per hour. And it requires a lot more infrastructure to make that happen. And so the infrastructure that is required actually spans from north of Hayward Park Station in San Mateo to south of the Redwood City Station. And because the infrastructure, that span of infrastructure that would be 4 tracks, is so extensive, it didn't really pan out in terms of a business case in the Caltrain business plan. And so therefore, the Caltrain business plan didn't necessarily support the implementation of the high growth scenario. And that's why the board adopted the moderate growth scenario as the preferred vision. And so while staff can't preclude such infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily mean we're actively planning for it. And we recognize that the high growth scenario would really only come to fruition far into the future and with other major regional projects like the second Transbay Tube, for instance. So therefore, staff at Caltrain is considering what this could mean for the existing grade separation designs and any upcoming rail-oriented studies that will certainly be taking place in Redwood City in the near future. In upcoming studies, it's on Caltrain staff to delve into what it means to not preclude that infrastructure. And it's possible that this issue could even go back to the JPB for additional feedback. But it's not appropriate to examine the 4-track segments in the grade separation analysis, as the grade separation analysis is funded by TA funds specifically for grade separation study. So, we intend to do more work on this, but for now, we think it's appropriate that the designs incorporate a 4-track station because that's what is adopted by the Caltrain board.
And Melissa, could you address, and I know we did talk about it a little bit earlier before this person joined us, just that whole Dumbarton rail connection?
Yep, I was just about to get to that. This is my long-winded answer. It's complicated, right? So in terms of Dumbarton, Eileen read my mind. We're working with Samtrans because they currently have a number of alternatives on the table that are multimodal. So we're going to continue to work with them to understand, to better understand those alternatives. And I think they hope to narrow them down in some way into the future. So those conversations will certainly inform the city's transit district work, our grade separation work, and other upcoming rail-oriented work that we're starting to scope out in Redwood City.
Great. Thank you. Again, just for those of you who have joined a little bit later, we do have a virtual site that you can see a picture of there. You can reach that by going to rwctransitplan.com, and you can go around in the room, including tapping on our question and answer session #1 video, and this evening's video will be posted soon, as well as written answers to all the questions we've taken so far. So if you have joined us a little bit late, we do have the opportunity for you to catch up by going online and seeing the YouTubes and seeing a bunch of the material that's available online and clicking. It's pretty intuitive. If you feel like you need a tutorial, there is actually a tutorial hanging on that wall right there. Peter's showing us the demo there. You can have a welcome by the mayor, and all kinds of materials are there. So we really appreciate you joining us. And let's move on to the next question, which is related to quiet zones. This was also a topic of our meeting pre-holiday. And the question is, how do we get one put in Redwood City? Can we? What's the process, et cetera? And Jessica, I know you've looked into that as our city transportation manager.
Thank you. Yes, so quiet zones are a pretty complicated topic, but that's a precursor for another little bit of a long-winded answer here. But they basically can only be created by an agency like Redwood City that has authority over the traffic control and enforcement at the crossings. So that's us, not Caltrain. So in order for us to establish a quiet zone, we have to implement FRA approved safety measures at each of the grade crossings within the proposed quiet zone area. And these crossings, so the quiet zone crossings must have flashing lights, warning time devices, power out indicators, and gates that create crossing closures when a train travels through. Although additional measures may include upgraded 4-quadrant gates as opposed to standard 2-quadrant gates, concrete medians, street closures, and one-way street conversions. So even with all these improvements, it's still possible that FRA would not approve a quiet zone if they don't think that the improvements would mitigate the loss of the train horns to warn people of an oncoming train. So fundamentally, the train's horns are sounded to let people know that trains are coming, and we want to make sure that everybody's safe when they're crossing the train tracks. So again, what they're looking at is, are all these modifications that you're making to the crossing gonna make it more safe than if the trains were sounding their horns? So a lot of these medians and changes to street directions can be infeasible because they really limit how traffic can circulate through a neighborhood. And they can also be really expensive, upwards of $3 million at each crossing. And we also want to let you know that a quiet zone only silences the routine sounding of train horns at grade crossings. So even within an established quiet zone, trains are still required to sound horns when they're approaching occupied station platforms, construction zones, or whenever a trespasser is spotted by the conductor in the railroad right-of-way. So like any capital improvement project, this would be a multi-year project to plan, design, and build after we've gotten funding for the improvements. So right now, our approach is to settle on our long-term grade separation strategy and then revisit this question of whether it makes sense to invest in what would be sort of shorter term improvements and where and when it might make sense to set up a quiet zone. So again, a little bit of a long-winded answer, but hopefully hit on sort of the key opportunities and constraints that come with a quiet zone.
Thanks, Jessica. And since you brought up costs and started to throw out some numbers, we do have a question from this evening about what are the current and future cost estimates for the different locations and who would pay for it. So kind of, what do you know now? How is it going to be funded? How does that happen?
Yeah, the $1 million question, or rather the $1 billion question if you're dealing with a grade separation project throughout the whole city. So project costs really haven't been estimated at this early phase of the planning study. That said, when you look at recent grade separation projects in the area as reference, a project to separate a single at-grade crossing would typically cost hundreds of millions of dollars, while a project to separate all of our at-grade crossings could easily cost over $1 billion. Combining multiple grade crossings into a single project reduces the overall cost by limiting the number of times that we'd have to build temporary tracks. So when you're doing a grade separation, you have to provide for ongoing Caltrain service. So we always have to build as basically a new set of tracks so that Caltrain can operate while the grade separation is being built. In terms of the funding side, while there is some grade separation funding available in San Mateo County's Measure W, which has a pot of roughly $68 million, although that does depend on what sales taxes come in and likely has been impacted by the pandemic, at least in a short term. But we'd still need a lot, as an understatement, of additional funding. Grade separations projects take many years to plan and build, and so potential funding at this early stage of project development could be derived from a wide variety of sources, including federal, state, and local sources. Redwood City grade separations may be eligible for additional funding because they're integrated with the need for a 4-track station, which would expand corridor capacity and be consistent with Caltrain's adopted service vision. So the fact that we're building this hub or transfer station in downtown Redwood City potentially opens up this new pot of funding, which would really advance our ability to get the grade separations built. So the upcoming Caltrain corridor-wide grade separation study is going to kick off this year, and we'll look more closely at funding for grade separations for the whole Caltrain corridor. So we're looking forward to for Caltrain coming up with some exciting new strategies for funding what is a very daunting capital budget.
So
Melissa, is there anything that you
boil
want
that
to
down. It doesn't come out of your pocketbook in Redwood City necessarily. You'll be looking for other funds from other places, right?
Yeah, definitely hoping to. And I think if, there may be at some points commitments of local city funding, but that's most likely to come from transportation impact fee or developer contributions, I think are the most likely sources from us.
Well, we are out of questions that have been put through the function, the Q&A function. For those of you who are on and haven't had a chance to ask your question yet, we are getting close to our adjournment period, so please start typing in now. Again, to remind you, we have always the ability to take these questions through the virtual room. That address again is rwctransitplan.com, or you can go onto the city's website and just search for grade separations. You'll find a more traditional website as well with all the same and similar materials. We do have a live survey that is up, and we'll continue to take feedback and always check back because we've been having a series of things to ask for community input on. I also wanted to just, for some of you who joined us a little bit later, we are doing another one of these question and answer sessions on February 3rd, and that'll be from 5 to 6:30. And if you sign up in the virtual room and give us your email, you'll get a direct email, and we will be using all the ways that we had for channels to get people to come and join us this evening. We'll also be putting out this information that way as well. We do believe that this meeting on February 3rd will have a heavy focus on traffic and traffic impacts and maybe some new traffic patterns, but that doesn't mean it has to be the only focus. So we will be continuing to take questions through the website and incorporating them into our meeting on February 3rd. So let's see if I have any more. Okay, I do have a new question. So if you close Brewster, that means diverting traffic will travel north on Aguila Street to use Whipple Avenue, and more traffic congestion on Whipple, and drivers will cut through Stafford Street to get to San Carlos. We already have an issue with drivers speeding on Stafford during the evening rush hour. Please install a stop sign on Stafford and E Street. So I'm going to have that over to Jessica about just whether that's something you're already aware of, and also just a commercial again for that's the type of thing that is being looked at by our traffic consultant, Bill, and we'll be able to focus down if we don't have a thorough answer this evening. We'll be posting Q&As online as well as doing a deeper dive on February 3rd. But let's see if we can get some answer to this question tonight about potential for a Stafford and East Street stop sign and sort of the cut through, and whether or not the diversion would actually use some of these streets in the neighborhood. Jessica, some thoughts on that?
Sure. And actually, thanks for zooming in. Maybe I'll start with this. So obviously this shows Brewster and the cross streets. So yeah, if one of the alternatives that we pick and we decide that the best option is actually completely closing Brewster, people that are coming down Brewster and aren't familiar with the area and wanted to cross the tracks there, if they're not able to, if they're heading north, yes, they could go north and actually make the crossing at Whipple, or they may head south to cross at Broadway, if that's an option. As part of the project, we wouldn't get into the level of deciding if there are other sort of traffic mitigations that would need to happen until we have actually a preferred alternative and understand what the sort of the implications of the preferred alternative are. To the extent that there's a need for a stop sign today at Stafford and East Street, that's something that I'm happy to evaluate. I'm not sure, I don't recall off the top of my head if that's something that we've evaluated in the past, but we have very clear state and federal standards that we use to evaluate the need for stop signs, completely apart from the grade separation work. But, again, going back, if we did have an alternative where we were closing Brewster and that increase in traffic volumes necessitated putting in a stop sign for safety reasons, then that would be done as a mitigation measure of the grade separation project. But Peter, maybe you could go over to the traffic analysis piece. And I just want to show that there. So we do have some preliminary traffic analysis results that are in the virtual room and on the project webpage that talk about these options. So looking at, it's going to be the bottom right scenario. So this is one of the scenarios that we analyzed was what's going to happen if you close both Brewster and Broadway. So like this is the scenario of what could happen for alternative 4. And so what you can see is the level of service on Whipple at the 2 adjacent intersections, one with Arguello and one at El Camino. They do get much worse than they are today. So that sort of reinforces what your sense was, is that, you know, people are gonna not cross there and they're gonna use Arguello to get up to Whipple. So we do see an increase in volume that would go on Arguello potentially, or frankly, if people, once the grade separation's done and the street is closed, it's also possible that people are going to take completely different routes because they know that they can't cross at Brewster. But it's not unreasonable to assume that at least some percentage of them would go on Arguello. So if we end up with an alternative that recommends that, we'd certainly be looking at whether there's a need to put in additional traffic control at intervening intersections to make sure that they're safe and operate well.
So just as a follow-up, because I happened to notice when some of the people were joining, the person who asked that question wasn't a beneficiary of our schedule question very early on in the meeting. And I'm going to ask Millette if she could share that PowerPoint slide. And Jessica, if you could speak to that. I believe this person certainly heard about the funding part, but let's talk a little bit about project development and just how long from now that new traffic pattern might realistically be in play. I mean, it's certainly not going to be next week.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Millette.
And this again is a high level overview of the project development schedule for a typical grade separation project. So because of the size and scope of these projects, are really mega projects for our area, they take 7 to 10 years to develop. So it would be quite some time before these changes are implemented. And who knows what the traffic's going to look like then. But like I said, you know, throughout this process, the more information we get, we're going to continue to update the designs and the alternatives to make sure that any adverse impacts or unintended consequences that may come along with the project are appropriately mitigated.
Great. So I am not seeing, unless I'm missing it, I am not seeing any new chats or question and answers that have been offered by our attendees this evening. We had very great questions, both the ones that were submitted online, as well as the ones that were submitted live this evening. We very much appreciate your attendance. And this meeting will be posted soon, and we will get the frequently asked questions document out very quickly as well. So you have the advantage of having that. Please promote this with your friends and colleagues and neighbors. And we hope that you'll join us again on February 3rd. And again, appreciate all the work that